My name is Joan Garvin. This presentation is drawn from a conference paper I delivered some years ago, and though the research is not updated, I believe the central argument remains relevant. While I move through the paper, I draw from the work of the Australian graphic artist Mary Leunig by way of illustration. What it means to be a mother has changed fundamentally over recent decades. In the 1960s in Australia, women who worked in skilled occupations such as banking, education or health were required to leave their jobs when they were married. There was a marriage bar. Today, the vast majority of young women often work in a job until a few weeks before the first baby is born. They often have career plans, but more importantly, they carry with them aspirations for their lives, generally quite apart from their partners or children, a sense of self and a sense of personal entitlement. The role that midwives play is unique and stands with women at the crossroads between the old pre-child self and a new with-child selfhood that carries many contradictions and potentialities. I want to emphasise that the often stated definition of midwifery, with woman, has both medical and social implications. According to the definition in the federal government report, Women-Centred Care Strategic Directions for Australian Maternity Services, woman-centred care considers the woman's individual circumstances and aims to meet the woman's physical, emotional, psychosocial, spiritual and cultural needs. Though I understand there are gaps and hurdles between the written word and the reality in practice. When a child is born, so are a set of relationships: mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts, grandparents, cousins, a whole spectrum. The birth of a child is a social event. Within the contemporary social context, the birth of a child has been linked to a significant change for both parents, a critical life stage that is often experienced as overwhelming, and thus an area of research has developed around what has been termed the transition to parenthood. The transition to parenthood is a phenomenon described by psychologists, highlighting a series of adjustments both men and women are said to negotiate when they become a parent, or more recently referred to as, for women, as matrescence. Longitudinal research has shown that a significant proportion of couples or individuals struggle with issues arising from changes to one's identity, changes to work and career options, negotiating with one's partner, changes to relationships with partner, friends and family, increased workload at home, and identifying the boundaries between child and self. The empirical research on T2P is predominantly carried out by psychologists, but also family practitioners, marriage therapists, health workers, and a sprinkling of sociologists, and some emerging work from within women's studies. The literature on the transition to parenting can be traced back to the 1950s, with the focus being on parenthood as crisis. An important impetus for the continuing research has been gender equity within the household, but further to this, the most commonly referenced authors, Cowan and Cowan, stated that they were concerned to strengthen the couple relationship and support children. And herein is a key tension between care and equity that I have explored in my thesis, Maternal Ambivalence in Contemporary Australia, Navigating Equity and Care, which is available to view online. The trends on the transition to parenthood that I refer to in my paper are drawn from 14 reports that represent extensive research from the United States, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, and some work in Australia. There's ample evidence in the literature of a return to what is termed traditional gender role practices once a baby is born. That is, men often work longer hours so as to provide financially for their families, and the vast majority of women take on a greater load of the household and childcare duties, even if they too are working full-time. This dynamic is evident even with couples who have expressed a belief in equality in the home and a desire to go against the trends. An attempt was made in a US study that divided the respondents' style of parenting into 3 groups: traditional, gender legacy, and post-gender. Amongst the conclusions, the authors noted that issues of equality were rarely addressed in couple education. Processes that were said to maintain mothering as a gendered activity were a perceived natural connection between mothers and knowledge, fathers stepping back, or mothers organising their time around their children, and mothers taking continual responsibility. Even though they identified a trend towards collaborative parenting styles among their respondents, they concluded that in order to change the unequal distribution of labour, parents of young children have to consciously work against the prevailing motherhood discourse. That was by Cowdery and Knudsen. The perpetuation of the maternal role through cultural practices has been well developed by Nancy Chodorow in her classic work called The Reproduction of Mothering. Her explanation of a gendering of psychological processes through the cultural practice of women taking on the primary caring role can explain this perceived natural connection. Her retort has been for more men to mother so as to alleviate the impasse, and yet there's been an unwillingness or inability of institutions or practices to change. Couple education in Australia, either in marriage preparation or antenatal classes, have rarely included topics related to egalitarian caring routines and possibilities, and thus by omission they reinforce past cultural practices and beliefs. Baby Makes 3 is an important exception and provides a model, as does Ellie Taylor's work on Becoming Us. Of the 14 studies I'm drawing from, one raised issues to do with maternal gatekeeping and related levels of stress and anxiety for some women if their male partners took on more housework and childcare than was expected. The authors spoke of this dynamic as a violation of women's expectations, and they argued that researchers should not blindly assume egalitarianism in parenting is desired. I agree, it can't be assumed that egalitarian arrangements are desired by all. However, research indicates that in the order of 70% of individuals or couples set out to achieve an equal balance, and therefore I argue there's a need for programs to be adapted. Turning to links between transition to parenting and midwifery, continuing concerns with poor birth outcomes have resulted in a significant failure to engage with and address the issues that arise in the postnatal phase, though it is encouraging to see the recommended extension of postnatal care moving from 6 weeks to 12 months in the Women-Centred Care Report. It's commonly recognised that there's a lack of research on the social aspects of midwifery. Nursing research is heavily influenced by medical and psychological approaches to understand the experience of new mothers. For example, Reva Rubin's work from the 1960s to the 1980s on maternal role attainment and the bonding theories of Klaus, Bowlby and Ainsworth. The nursing literature rarely moves beyond description and infrequently attempts to explain the transition to parenthood. Furthermore, the literature on the transition to parenthood often emphasises the behavioural and psychological aspects of new parenthood and identity factors rather than the social context. And I think there's a good opportunity here for anyone who wants to pursue these topics in further research. A comprehensive manual jointly published by Australian and New Zealand midwives, published in 2006, Midwifery Preparing for Practice, provides an excellent historical overview and theoretical approaches to the study of medicine and midwifery, concluding with the most recent postmodern work on reflexivity, subjectivity and difference. However, the chapter called Transition, in contrast, draws on theoretical underpinnings from Bowlby's attachment theory in the 50s to maternal role attainment and behavioural and psychosocial aspects of transition and caregiving systems. Looking at the issues from an individual psychosocial perspective and failing to engage with the wider sociological critiques. The most disappointing aspect of the chapter is the discussion of transition to motherhood, where the authors move straight on to topics and issues relevant to child development rather than acknowledging or addressing key issues of concern for contemporary women. The current government response to the first 1,000 or 2,000 days is sadly most often baby and child focused, with little reference to the health and well-being of women and their families, while during these early years the mother-infant dyad remains critical. The publication The New Midwifery, Science and Sensitivity in Practice, edited by Leslie Page, argued that the woman-led model of birth was linked to the changing role of women in society, and I contend that the strategy has been built on liberal assumptions which individualises the birth experience. Embedded and unexplored in this agenda are notions of motherhood and of family that are outmoded. I've come across very little midwifery research which acknowledges the diversity of family form and practices in contemporary society. Furthermore, an inherent problem with woman-led approach to care is that women cannot know or understand the breadth of the issues they may well confront when they become a mother, as documented in the literature on the T2P. There's a role for midwives and/or maternal and child health nurses to take a lead by providing information, both key points and links to appropriate services, before the clientele move on to the later stages of early parenthood and issues related to the T2P. It's surprising just how little attention has been given in the midwifery research to the experience of first-time mothers, particularly considering the vast array of materials on the topic. The most relevant debate is one highlighted by Ramona Mercer between what she called becoming a mother versus maternal role attainment. Mercer rightly brings attention to the inadequacies of women's work in the contemporary context, but she continues to bring together the role with the identity, mothering and motherhood. The slip from practice to social structure and associated expectations, for example, this is a quote from her work. The commitment, attachment and preparation stage in which a woman's work is becoming a mother begins has long-range implications. The woman's active involvement in this stage has been consistently linked to a positive adaptation to motherhood. The woman experiences a transformation of self in becoming a mother, as her self expands to incorporate a new identity and assume responsibility for her infant and her infant's future world. That's true in a sense that your identity does expand and change, but the reference to adapting to motherhood, I think, is something that needs more critique. You can understand why it has been of concern that women assume the mothering role for the protection of vulnerable baby from an era when women had little choice. But what of the new father? What of shared parenting? These models assume the mother as a primary caregiver, mothering and motherhood. There's a blossoming of new midwifery research centres in the UK and Australia. I fully support the call by a number of researchers for more academic engagement with the midwifery literature, particularly in the context of social change, and a critique of the materials on becoming a mother. The practice of midwifery is a cultural and historical experience that will differ through cultures and through time. Furthermore, the social meaning of midwifery is a product of discourse and policy. In order to describe such an occupation is an exercise in interpretation that involves values and perceptions of the observer and the observed. The focus has been on child-bearing rather than child-rearing, and the medical model has blurred the distinction between Adrienne Richards' categories of motherhood and mothering in her classic work of Woman Born. Medicalisation psychologically characterises women as reproducers, confusing the individual and the social. Individuals are not passive recipients of this structuring, but are actively engaging and interpreting these messages. However, the messages given through these kinds of assumptions reinforce past practice at the expense of current aspirations. Attempts by midwives to restore agency to women need to be informed by contemporary social analysis and pay more attention to the social context of birth. The lack of services postpartum has been criticised in numerous reports. Sally Marchant described the lack as a yawning gap between the intention and the provision of postnatal care. There's a significant discord between the services and the postpartum need. She continued, women voiced a need for more information and support in order to make the best choices in their new role as a mother for themselves, their infants, and the family as a whole. Christine Henderson, while Senior Research Fellow at the School of Health Sciences, the University of Birmingham, maintained it is well known that the current pattern of birthing is not necessarily effective and that women suffer ill health beyond the 28 days period after giving birth. In fact, much of the research on the postnatal phase concludes far too early, generally around 3 months after birth. This often has an adverse effect on parenting. Drawing from interviews with 40 women, Bonnie Fox and Diane Wart argued that social support may be a critical factor in maternal health and well-being, both through the birth and after, resulting in class differences in the birth experience, simply because the support services have become a commodity that can be bought if the disposable income is available. Social relations within the hospital privatise social reproduction, and childbirth becomes isolated and medicalised and devoid of the social context. Fox and Warts maintain that the dearth of social support for women post-birthing affected decisions made in hospital regarding pain and birthing procedures. They emphasise that the social context of the birth and the essentially privatised responsibility for child health and well-being influenced decisions women made throughout their birth experience towards medical interventions. They stated the autonomy of new mothers is predicated on the existence of strong and well-integrated systems of social support. Women often battle with maternal activity, not identity, argued Jane Marie Marr. She referred to works by Hayes in 1996, Gary 1999 and Featherstone 1998, in which the authors brought attention to a distinction between motherhood as a state of being and the everyday practices that mothers carry out on behalf of their children. Marr noted structural constraints that women face clearly limit their choices and said that new models of motherhood may not necessarily affect change. Furthermore, there is a trend in the research arguing that an ideology of motherhood is perpetuating inequality within marriage after a child is born. Both factors are, I argue, indicative of a need to analyse issues that surface in this critical life stage, the T2P, within the wider cultural and social context. Pregnancy marks the beginning of a new phase of life for the woman. The women Lucy Bailey interviewed indicated a sense of having entered or been on the edge of a whole new world, bringing out different facets of their personalities. Bailey described the ways in which women interpreted their experiences as a reconceptualisation of self. The self refracted through a prism of pregnancy and thereby presenting an opportunity for change and for agency. The pregnant woman's new experience of her body often leads to embracing of a newly gendered identity. Gender is produced through the process of acquiring a self-conception rather than preceding it. This claim by Bailey is well substantiated by the literature. The T2P, or matriescence, most often occurs within families, and the couple relationship is central to family dynamics. Couples often negotiate issues related to equity and care within a social and economic system that has been built on an assumption of the male breadwinner, or more recently, the independent worker wage fixing model. Cultural expectations are outstripping the ability of the system to change, and consequently, there's a significant trend towards what is often called traditional gender roles when a couple have a baby. There is currently a reappraisal of what it means to be a mother, a father, or a family that is evidenced in both public debate and the avalanche of materials. I argue that the ante and postnatal curriculum and services needs to be responsive to these debates, not necessarily taking sides or promoting a position, but at least acknowledging issues and providing links to services and/or information or resources. There's ample evidence that issues related to the transition to parenting are commonly experienced. Therefore, it would be useful if the antenatal classes and all maternal and child health nurses drew attention to the issues that may arise and bring attention to relevant programs or literature. When I was reviewing the materials on midwifery, a recurring theme is the aim to be with the woman. I argue that in order to achieve the aim, an important aspect of the work of midwives is to place themselves squarely within the contemporary social context so that they may relate to the birthing couples. I understand that the reality of this is challenging because social mores are ever-changing and diverse, but the range of the role of the midwife in itself is unique. The birth of a child is both a medical and a social event, and if midwives do not respond adequately to the total package, the goal of being with the woman cannot be achieved. And if you'd like to discuss or talk further about what I've been saying in this paper, please write to me at my email address. That's Garvan, Garvan, Joan, @gmail.com.